Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Delighted to be joined by the Managing Partner of Workforce Transformation, Chris Love. Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Simon.
No, you're welcome. We've known each other for a while. I think we first met when I was working at Boots, which is some 9-10 years ago now. Do you want to give the listeners a brief background of how you got to be Managing Partner at REPL?
I started working for Mitchells & Butlers, which is one of the UK's largest hospitality retailers, sort of straight out of university, and worked there for 10 years. The final project that I was involved in there was a workforce transformation project. So we implemented scheduling into Mitchells & Butlers. Towards the end of that project, I think we realised that the dynamics of the market was shifting and this type of technology was going to become more prevalent and important to retailers. So a couple of us, me and a colleague of mine, Mike Callender, left Mitchells & Butlers and set up REPL about 12 years ago, and have sort of continued to work in this space throughout that time.
You've had an amazing growth journey since then. How many employees have you got now, and how many countries do you work in?
Yeah, good question. So there were two of us to begin with, and we've now grown to almost 400 people. Our main countries are Northern Europe, US, South Africa and Japan. But actually, I did a count the other day, and we've delivered WFM into 56 countries around the world, so almost everywhere, with some of the world's biggest retailers. So it's been a really exciting journey for us, and we're still growing very fast. We've just finished our financial year and grown at 40% last year, which is very exciting for us all.
Yeah, some amazing growth and amazing stories, and we worked together on a number of projects over those years, and some planned when we get back to some point of normality post-COVID. So you talked about what started you in workforce transformation. What problem were you trying to solve at Mitchells & Butlers? What was the need to get you all together?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And actually, it's interesting to talk about what the business case for something like workforce management was all those years ago and how that's evolved over time. So, when we were at Mitchells & Butlers, it was a sort of everyday low-cost retailer. So a lot of the benefits case and driver for it was around cost saving. So, they were looking to save 1% to 2% of labour costs. And I think that was partly because of the business model that they had in place. I think, you'll know this from your work, Simon, over those kind of 10 years, I think retailers shifted dramatically and is much more focused on providing a great sort of consumer experience, but also looking after their employees. So, if we went back to a business like Mitchells & Butlers now, I think the business case would be very different. I think it would have transitioned from purely a cost-saving exercise more into sort of, customer and employee-centric business case driving sales, retention, motivation of employees. So it's very interesting to have watched the transition of that over the last sort of 10 years.
I think the whole thing's transformed, hasn't it, from those projects that took years and years to implement with thousands of days and thousands of customizations through to much slicker processes, obviously all in the cloud now. And as you say, varying business cases. We see much less like you of it's all about cost to it being much more about colleague-centric, customer-centric, the whole communication piece and all those other bits that come into play. Does that ring true with what you see?
Yeah, and a good example of this is one of our biggest clients, Walmart, and actually all the stuff that I'm going to talk about now is all public domain, so I'm not sharing anything that I shouldn't do. But I think they would be the first to admit that a few years ago they did, treat their colleagues, as commodity. That they've realised that they need to transition to a much more employee-centric model. So they've made big investments in not only paying their staff more money, but also really focusing on the patterns of working, flexibility that their colleagues are after, and just providing an all-around better environment for them to work in. And I think it's transformed their business. I think they would be the first to admit that. I listened to one of their sort of senior people at NRF this year talk about the investment they've made in their sort of middle management staff in stores and the returns that they've got from doing that. I think it's a really great example of a retailer that runs on tight margins, everyday low-cost retailer, but understands the power of making investment in their employees. And I truly believe that the business cases around WFM will focus much more on that than pure payroll savings in the future. They'll have to if those retailers, want to compete. What is, an accelerating and changing retail landscape, right?
Yeah, well, things are changing all the time at the time of recording, aren't they? In lockdown, we're not sure what the new normal looks like. I think the only guaranteed thing is that it's not going to be the same as where we came from. When people talk about going back to normal, I think that might be a different normal is what it looks like. So that obviously brings big resource deployment challenges in the changing world today. Historically, what are the biggest challenges you've seen in resource deployment? And then we can probably fast forward to what we think they might be post this lockdown.
The challenges do vary by different sectors, but I think one of the kind of major challenges I think people have to face into is getting the balance right between optimizing a schedule and considering the quality of life of the employees. And I think for all the reasons I spoke about before, quality of life is important if you want to have a motivated and you want to retain your workforce. I think if you kind of translate that to the technology that's used, I think the technology has shifted as well to get a better balance of optimization and quality of life. So I think that's an interesting challenge that retailers have to consider, and it's interesting in as much as it's a more of a sort of medium long-term play. I think it's very easy for you to get into a sort of vicious cycle as a retailer of saving money, short-term benefits, but that then potentially driving down sales and having to go through that cycle again, versus a more virtuous cycle where if you make the investment in your employees and their quality of life, then over time your sales will grow, and therefore you can make sort of double down on that investment. So I think that's an interesting challenge for retailers to be able to look at that medium to long term, particularly where retail is quite a short term business in lots of respects.
Yeah, and I think historically the sales journey of workforce management was all around fully automated. So you'd pump a load of data in about employees, lots of preferences, and they'd have to be absolutely 100%. You press a button and the magic schedule comes out. And I think very quickly people learned that that's really difficult to work because it hasn't got the local nuances of each store or cafe or hotel. So it didn't get worked, and you just see it on the wall with a load of pen over it saying, well, Billy's not working 8 till 5, crossed out, he's working 9 till 2. And you'd spent all this time, money, effort to get to this amazing schedule. As soon as it was on the wall, it was crossed out. So as you say, the balance of computer says yes, computer says no has moved the other way to give us some boundaries to work within. And as the software from all the different vendors that are out there now becomes easier to use, quicker to implement, it's much more of a framework to work in than this is what the computer says, this is what you must do, which doesn't engage anybody. The leadership in the sites, the colleagues, they all work against it rather than with it. For me, we're at the other end of the spectrum now of almost, here's some tools to work with and an enabler. Do the best you can with what you've got in your local store, but what you say you're going to do it.
I think we're at sort of a tipping point in terms of technology. I mean, if you look where retailers have made a big investment in sort of personalizing the consumer experience, so you know what I mean by that. People get segmented into different groups and targeted based on their profile. I truly believe that's going to be the case with employees, because I mean, as you said earlier, at the moment it's a bit blunt, the scheduling process. Are you available? Can you do the job? Okay, I'm going to schedule you. It doesn't really take into account any of the factors that perhaps a human would in terms of the time of day that people prefer to work, who they prefer working with, what are their sort of lifestyle choices around looking after the kids, going to sports days, those sorts of things. And I think with the advent of machine learning, and I know it's a bit of an overused term, but I think that the scheduling solutions will be able to crunch a lot more data about an individual and therefore still optimize the schedule, but take into account the individual's quality of life, which we know drives significant benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting how 5, 6, 7 years of the people selling fully automated is the answer, and then quickly it evolved to where we are today. And the next generation then post this lockdown is going to be even more interesting, because I've seen on LinkedIn and various other places some of the workforce management companies posting around their messaging capability or emailing capability that they're offering out in this environment now to show some of the softer benefits of that whole colleague communication part. And it almost means that the historic workforce management, so your scheduling, forecasting, time and attendance, is a secondary part of that, where it's always been workforce management components first, and hey, guess what, we can do a bit of task management, we can do a bit of colleague comms. So that, I think that's interesting how they've almost flipped it. Clever in this environment.
I think one of the things that will come out of the sort of the COVID situation is, we're sort of referring to it as a new relationship between employers and employees. I mean, if you take some of the examples of, the hospitality retailers that have had to furlough virtually all of their staff, I think the chances of all of those people returning to work in that business are pretty small, right? That some of those people will have gone off and taken other jobs in other sectors, other businesses where perhaps they feel they're, it's a little bit more secure. So I think that there'll be a sort of dearth of employees wanting to go back into retail in itself will change the relationship between the employer and the employee a little bit more towards the employee. So people will have, employers will have to make sure that when they're creating schedules, they're taking into account that those choices the employee wants to make. I also think it's very interesting what you say about the communication side of it as well. We were talking to some fashion retailers who have global business. The single biggest challenge they've had throughout all of this crisis, from a workforce perspective, not necessarily from a sort of revenue and stock perspective, is they had no effective way of communicating with their frontline workers. They still had a very traditional, we'll perhaps email the store manager and he'll tell the department heads, and the department heads will tell the employees. So there's two issues. That one is obviously the Chinese whispers. The message doesn't flow through particularly well. But also, because of the speed of transition from stores being open to shut, they just weren't able to communicate effectively with those people. And now they're furloughed, it's almost impossible. So I think whereas people would sometimes have struggled a little bit to pull together a business case for something like employee communications or task management, coming out of the COVID crisis, that won't be the case, and that WFM will pivot towards that communications and task management angle as you described, because they'll have to. Because I think everybody realizes that we're not just going to go straight back to the way it was before, and there's going to be periods of potentially lockdown, maybe in smaller geographical zones, but it's still going to happen, and therefore an effective way of communicating with the staff is going to be more important than ever.
Yeah, and I think the other thing it's going to drive is, I've seen bits of it happening, people working across locations. So as you talked about, maybe less people come back to hospitality, let's say, and move out back into wider retail. They're going to have to be smarter at how they utilize resource. And, some industries, pharmacists, for example, are shared across different stores and have been historically. Just, you need to make sure you've got cover because you always need one, all that kind of stuff. As you start to look wider, I know people have played with it. So having hub and spokes or satellites or whatever terminology they want to use. I think it's really interesting the way people will explore where they've got tight-knit geographies of locations, almost managing resource above that level. Yeah. I may only be able to work in store A and that's what I want to do and that's fine, but you might be able to work in store A, B and C and are quite happy to jump across depending on where the workload requirement is. So the smart ones or the forward-thinking ones, I think, will start to utilise multi-site working a lot more than we've seen historically.
What the crisis has sort of created is a much more flexible workforce in lots of ways. I mean, I still look at retailers who don't even cross-skill within a store, particularly, like some of the big grocers and department stores where you think it's logical that they could work in different departments, but they just don't. And I think obviously then the natural extension of that is to share resources across stores. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, how if you look at the grocery sector, there's been a rapid sort of move away from convenience back to doing a big weekly shop, and therefore you have to move your staff from working in convenience stores to back to the big stores. That process is more complicated, I think, than people would imagine. The more sort of out there idea would be around pooling resources across retailers. Yeah. I mean, I think we certainly know there's been some formal and informal partnerships done both in Europe and the US around that. Like, again, one of our customers, Aldi, we know they've taken a lot of, Aldi in the US, have taken a lot of employees from hospitality retailers where they had sort of connections at board levels, and they've instead of taking them individually, have taken them in bulk, basically, because they know that they've been background checked and they know that they can be trusted, and et cetera, et cetera. I feel like that idea of, I think we've almost created a gig economy overnight, and people who wouldn't have considered themselves as flexible have had to become flexible. And I don't think they'll ever really want to go back to the old way of I do the same job every single day for the same retailer. What's interesting about that is I think the software providers, and this is going to be difficult for them, I think, are going to need to try to find a way of working together to make that more more feasible, because I don't think you're going to find a situation where all retailers use the same WFM tool. They're all going to use different tools, but there needs to be some kind of standard way of transferring people from one system to the other so that pooling of resource can be effectively delivered.
Problems can be solved with technology. It's just, like you say, collaboration and
willingness
to work together. But that then comes back to the comms stuff we talked about before and the engagement piece, because if I'm working in 3 different organizations as a colleague, and that's great for me, I love the variety. I find it, just refreshing that it's not the same old day in, day out. I'm going to need to be kept up to date from all of those organizations of what's happening in the business, changes to things. So it plays back into you've got the WFM part you probably need to link, but there may also be that stream of comms or task. And then there's a whole debate around payroll as well, and who theoretically owns me and all that kind of stuff. So it may seem simple on the outside, and clearly people have done quickly in this environment. I'm sure there's some sticky plasters at the moment holding those processes together that need to be ironed out and created, and the ones get on board and go with it, and the software providers that work together will clearly be the ones that prosper if that's where we end up.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point there about that, which is it's one of these issues that people would have thought was perhaps was insurmountable, 8-10 weeks ago. The idea of sharing resources across retailers, people would have looked at that and said it's too difficult to comprehend. I think, as is the case of lots of things with the COVID crisis, it's accelerated the need to do it and broken down some of those barriers. Again, we were talking to one of our biggest customers in the US yesterday, and previously would have taken them about 2 weeks from the initial contact with a new employee to them actually working in a store, background checks, interviews, getting a uniform, all those sorts of things. That's now been streamlined to 1 day. They themselves, even amazed themselves about how quickly they can do that sort of stuff. So I think what it will do is it will demonstrate to people the art of the possible, which is always sometimes the truth in difficult times, isn't it? People just find ways of being creative. And what I'm really hopeful is that we won't lose that creativity in WFM. We'll sort of take the best bits of it, use it to make sort of lasting change to the employee experience of working in retail. Because I feel like if we don't, or retailers don't, then we're going to struggle to have enough people to work in the industry, because they will go off and do something else.
Yeah, the darkest of times drives the greatest of innovations. You see it now. Exactly. You see it in world wars. All those. I think some of that comes back to, for me, having, like you, worked on the other side, the bureaucracy goes away. So the procrastination, the naysayers, the but what if, and these are the consequences. It becomes much more of a, well, we'll test it, and if it doesn't work, we'll do something else. It's that, really, really, really agile. We know some stuff's not going to work, but actually, if there's 10 ideas that we've been struggling to do and 5 work or half work, we're in a better place than sitting here for 3 weeks procrastinating and coming up with all the reasons why it doesn't, or all the blockers, and not getting any further. And like you, I hope it doesn't, and people maintain some of that. Well, if we manage to do it then, why can't we do it now?
Sort of not overstating this too much, is that I do think that a lot of the way of working will go back post the crisis, but I do think that maybe 10-15% of the lessons that we've learned and the processes and improvements that have been in place will stay, and people will think harder about the relationship they have with their employees, given how difficult it's been to manage that based on the crisis, right? That's what I'm really, really hopeful for. And to be honest, talking to a lot of our customers, we have over 100 customers in retail that we speak to on a regular basis. The vast majority of them are feeling the same way. They're very confident, I think, that their business models will have to evolve, but will also survive, and that things will be different, but that there's still a big opportunity for them into the future.
Just got to accept in those things, you get some right and you get some wrong, but it's the ones that you get right where you get the big competitive or strategic advantage because you've been bold and brave. Yeah, interesting to see how that pans out. For those businesses that have either got WFM or have implemented it, where do you see what are the most common things that people do to get the best return on that investment? You said before it's a longer term piece, a medium to long term, which I think is spot on. Those businesses that see it as a short term, we're going to put this WFM system in and it's going to give us all the answers. For me, probably gives you more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But that's a good thing because it's surfacing stuff you didn't know about, you can fix, that drives efficiency, saves you cost, increases your service capability. What common trends are there in terms of those ones that get a really good return, uptake and engagement on their implementations? Because we've both seen organisations that have not got that or have put it in and it becomes just another thing that they run. So they're almost a benefit, or the project team move on and it's project done, ticked. Whereas I always liken WFM to EPOS. You put a till system in, teams have to press the buttons in the right order to take the cash or the credit card payment. So it's binary. You can't really get it wrong. Whereas WFM, you put it in, you're not really sure what it's going to tell you. You're not really sure what you're going to have to deal with. But actually, if you treat it as a project, in both those instances, the project teams disappear. The till system still works. The WFM one, actually, you've not really answered any of the questions. The hard work starts when you start running it almost.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent kind of observation. And I mean, there's some really obvious things that are true of most IT projects, but I think are probably even more case with WFM. I think you have to treat this as a business change project, not as an IT delivery project. I mean, the technology is important, but it really is only a small part of making a success of this. I don't think if you're not prepared to face into making some changes to your business process and the way you operate, you'll always struggle to get the benefits out of it. I do think your point about not assuming there's a finite start and end to a project is a really important one. I think the retailers that have got the most out of their WFM implementations are the ones that deliver the initial business case, but then see it as a huge opportunity to analyze the data and the information that's coming out of WFM to then make continuing improvements to their labor model, their scheduling rules, their T&A processes. There's a huge amount of data that these systems generate, and if you are able to analyze it and interpret it correctly, it can drive lots of changes to your business processes, which drive exponentially greater benefits than the original business case. And I think there's some really great examples out there of people that have treated this more like a sort of service model, keep the project team, flip them into a sort of managed service model, gain huge benefits year on year from their implementations.
It's interesting because you said IT project. So should it be an IT project? I have a view. Be interesting to see yours.
No. I mean, I think we probably both share the same view. It has to be driven by, I think, operations. It needs to be the owner of any WFM project. Now, there's clearly you need involvement from IT, you need involvement from finance, HR, all those sorts of areas. But at its heart, it's a business change project. I mean, you're fundamentally affecting a major part of your business. When people work, how they work, productivity of those individuals, and how that's communicated to them during the project and afterwards is the single biggest factor in the success of it, in my opinion. So I don't want to sort of underplay the need for good technical skills and a good governance and all those sorts of things, but it certainly should be a business project for sure.
Yeah, I get worried if anybody tells me their WFM project is an IT project, because clearly it's about then selecting IT, not understanding the wider things around it. You struggle with engagement from HR, ops, finance. So I think that's a big watch out.
And I think, just sort of building on that a little bit, it's interesting because it's, the WFM market for technology is that there are a lot of solutions out there. And obviously they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but in lots of ways they're very similar. And I think the traditional sort of way of selecting a WFM tool, kind of classic RFP, functionally driven, it can be very difficult to differentiate between one solution and another.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think it often comes down more to the partnership that you can develop with the software vendor, not just at the IT level, but also at the operational level. How willing are they to commit to making your WFM project a success? I mean, I think that's the other part of, if I look at projects that have been successful and unsuccessful, a lot of it comes down to the software companies, not their base technology, but their willingness to partner with the retailer to sort of deal with complex issues. I mean, I've always said to people, if you've got 50 countries, you're a retailer with 50 countries, there is no WFM tool in the world that's going to do every single requirement. You have to accept there's an element of development work that has to occur just because it's complicated, and finding a partner software company that's going to be prepared to help you with that is actually almost the single most important selection criteria, because functionally they're all very, very similar.
Yeah, and I think that's classic. Are you selecting a partner? It's easy to both be giving each other high fives when it goes well, but the true test of any partnership is when you're in the kind of trenches and who's in there with you. There's always that element of in this together for the greater good. And I get there's commercials and agreements on both sides, but I always think it's who's standing by you when times are tough, not who's pointing a finger at who. I think that the thing we should talk about or mention briefly to anybody that's listening is around our joint events that we do throughout the year. We run together the Planning and Productivity Forum, I say normally because we're still working out how it's going to work this year. Have one big yearly event where we have kind of 50, 60 retailers, hospitality clients that come, and it really helps with that point in the conversation before about best practice. I always stand back and have an internal, when I see our clients, your clients, and people that work with both of us talking freely in those events, that's the real power for me, and I think that's the power for them. So not vendor led, no software, no talking about systems. People, I think probably most software WFM solutions are represented there, but it's not about who you use, it's about what you do with the outputs, how you drive those, and people at massively different stages of the journey. So I know Walmart spoke last year, it was brilliant, but then we had some other clients that hadn't even really got a solution and were trying to figure it all out. Anybody that's not been, watch the REPL LinkedIn, Twitter, the Rethink LinkedIn, Twitter, mine and Chris's profiles, because when we've firmed up plans for how we tackle it this year, depending on what we are and are allowed to do, we'll publish. But there's events throughout the year as well, isn't there, Chris, that we've put on?
It's one of my favourite things that we've done since I sort of started REPL, and obviously grateful for the partnership we have with you, Simon, on that. I mean, the thing that always makes me happy is reading the feedback from those events from the retailers that come along, and how useful they find the ability to sort of network and talk to other retailers doing similar jobs to them. And I think the proof is in the pudding, right? Which is it started relatively small when we first did it, probably like 5 or 6 years ago now, right? Yeah. And then I think at the last event, sort of 30, 40 retailers represented. It was a fantastic day, and in that, fingers crossed. Although I think it's becoming increasingly unlikely we can do something this year in the same vein. But I know that it's really well thought of by the retailers that participate, and certainly I know you probably find the same as well. Is that the ability to connect individual retailers with other people through that group has also proven, I think, very valuable, not only to us but to the retailers that we're connecting. And I think they're always very grateful for the fact we've pulled together that network of people. Yeah,
we'll figure something out for this year, whether it's virtual or not, but we'll definitely do something to kind of watch
100%.
Our profiles. Last question, and we're asking it to everybody who comes on the podcast. What's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
I think the best piece of business advice I ever was giving is to worry about the things you can control. And I know that's a very generic statement. I think it's probably rings true more now than ever. I mean, certainly, and you'll experience this, setting up a company and growing like we have it, there are times where, it can be quite stressful. That bit of advice and what I've learned to do is to concern myself with the things I can control and not worry about the things I can't control, and try to retain the agility in the business that we had when there was only 2 of us. And, obviously that's almost impossible now. We're at 400, but the core belief of we just have to accept the circumstances that we find ourselves in and pivot quickly and worry about the things we can control has really certainly helped me personally enormously over the last sort of 12 years. And I think it's helped the company survive, credit crunches, recessions, pandemics, all those things that have happened. So I'd say that was probably the best bit of advice.
Good. No, totally agree. You're in control of your own destiny and nobody else's. So excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. Everybody keep an eye out on our profiles for the updates on planning and productivity. Be out in the next kind of month or so, and we'll catch up soon. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Simon.